Well, hello, everybody. I am so excited to be sharing one of my favorite people on this planet today. Dr. Jade and I have known each other for going on 8 years now. He has been one of the most influential people in my life in spiritual and personal growth, in being a teacher and support system to me. And now he's also my boyfriend. So it just feels so appropriate to be bringing you to the show and sharing just your gifts, your wisdom, your insight. I get to learn from you pretty much every single day. And it's been such a gift to me. And I'm excited for other people to get to learn from you, but also for you to be able to really share your story and your experience in ways that you perhaps haven't before. So welcome, Jade. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, this is going to be fun. I freaking adore you. I love that we're doing this. I love this whole new project, and I love that we get to do this together. And yeah, I mean, I love this conversation because it's not, typically something I get to talk about kind of in this way. And of course, you've taught me just as much as people do. So yeah, I'm super excited. Let's enjoy this.
Yeah. So I think I want to give a little bit of context even before we get into your story, because you have quite an interesting professional background. So if you want to give us maybe a little bit of a glimpse into that to help us understand what it is that you actually do now.
Yeah, okay. So let's do a fast forward version of this. So I am a hybrid fitness professional and health professional. And I say that because I started personal training at 15 years old. That's the first time I ever made money doing anything in my life. And so I've been doing this now for 35 some years. That got me into biochemistry. That's what I studied in undergrad. Then I went to medical school. And that's kind of something I'll share with everyone because I was on my way to East Carolina University Medical School. And up until that time, I was personal training. I was training people in nutrition. And don't ask me why, but at that time, I did not take the time to look at the curriculum that I was going to study in medical school. And by the time I was getting ready to leave for medical school, I took a look at what I was going to be studying, and there was no nutrition, there was no psychology, and there was no exercise. And I immediately was like, okay, I am going to have to change professions, and basically dropped out for a time until I found a little known university called Bastyr University, which was one of 4 schools at the time that trained naturopathic physicians, what are now known as functional medicine doctors. I had no idea this was going to become a thing and it would become mainstream. It did. I went into that field, specialized in female endocrinology, female hormones. And then after about 20 years in that field, moved into the area of transpersonal psychology and mindset, which sort of gets into the spirituality component, deep philosophy. And I'll say one more thing about that. I found my way into that work because as a seeker and someone who was a conscientious practitioner, what I saw is that the physical world of supplements, drugs, physical medicine, personal training, all of that kind of stuff got very little results. It didn't do for people what I hoped to be doing way back when I started doing this work. And that got me into mindset work and consciousness studies and how stories and beliefs shape who we are as humans and transform our lives. And so that gives you a very fast sort of breeze through of my sort of work. And so that's what I do today.
Love that. And I want to now go a little bit more into your background. And I'm just going to add like my personal anecdote from experience of knowing you intimately for such a long time. So when you and I first met in 2018, you were in this space of just total atheism. You said to me so many times, I don't believe in any of that woo-woo stuff. Like that's just, you were not into it, right? Fast forward a couple of years, and not very many years, I would say around 2021, you actually became a big catalyst in my own spiritual growth and journey. So I want to back up a little bit. So knowing that you've bounced around a bit from, between your belief systems, I want to hear really about, how you grew up, how your spiritual beliefs and practices evolved, what made the change toward eventual atheism, and then the shift again away from that. So yeah, tell us about you.
Yeah, so, well, imagine a relatively conservative Italian man family on my father's side, Catholic, and imagine that merging with my mom, who also was raised Catholic, went to Catholic school, but was more of a hippie. And so I came up, I would say, in a Catholic hippie background. And so I was kind of steeped. And just to give you all an idea, there were times where I would see my mother out in the woods in, like a tree pose, asking her what she's doing at 5 years old. And she's like, I'm being a tree, honey. This is where God lives. So I grew up with this, right? But I also grew up with a very religious grandfather, the head of the Italian family. My grandfather went to church and all of that kind of stuff, did First Holy Communion. So that was kind of my background, coming up. And I will tell you, I had very strange experiences as a child that kind of scared me. I would wake up at nights and I would see people standing at my bed like little kids. I would see cats glimpses of things out of my eyes and ask my mom, like, was that? I had this idea that I was seeing, at the time, ghosts, at least as a kid. That's what I thought they were. And then kind of moved away from that for a time in high school and went through my first breakup, as we do, my first form of suffering and figuring out that I wasn't the center of the universe, as we do. And at that time, I kind of went back to my hippie roots, my mom's hippie roots a little bit, and started dabbling in things like lucid dreaming and remote viewing and that kind of stuff. And this would have been 19, 20 years old. And then I went away to medical school, to a very alternative medical school. And at that time, this is where probably I adopted the mentality that you met me at. I was a pretty evidence guy, steeped in biochemistry and, all deep science, but playing around in the world of lucid dreaming and consciousness as a young sort of...
Can you share a little bit about what that actually means? Lucid dreaming and remote viewing and that kind of thing for people who may not know?
Yeah, well, so I actually don't know where I got this idea. My mom was into these sort of things, but she wasn't really into this. I think I picked up a book somewhere that was a book on lucid dreaming. And essentially what this entailed would be prior to bed doing a routine. And I remember some of this routine, but it would be centering yourself, going kind of into a meditative state. I would do some muscle relaxation, squeezing and relaxing muscles. And I would set an intention that I will remember my dreams and that I will be able to control my dreams. And what would then happen is I would begin to go into a dream state and I would become lucid. So this is the lucid part of dreaming. I would become lucid and conscious inside the dream that I was dreaming. And once I was able to do that, I could do all kinds of things that we love when we're dreaming, right? I can make things happen in the dream. I could decide I was going to fly in the dream. That actually got me into exploring out-of-body experiences in the dream, where I could say to myself, okay, now that I know I'm dreaming and now that I'm in control of the dream, I want to leave my body. And I would do things like, travel to, I'd be like, I want to travel to Egypt. I'll never forget this. One time I wanted to travel to Egypt and I found myself sitting on top of the pyramid. Now, just so you all understand, this still was all very dream-like. It wasn't like all of a sudden I was conscious. So I never got to the point, I know some people talk about it, I never got to the point back then of getting fully conscious like we are now talking. It was all dream-like. And so in my mind, I was just like, this is just dreaming still and me sort of in control. But I got to play around with it a little bit. And I did get to play around with a little bit of remote viewing and had some success with that inside of the dream. And I'll give you an idea what that is like. My mom, I was about 19, 20. She was in LA visiting. It was about, I would sleep in, right? In your early 20s, you're sleeping in, to go to class. And I knew she was there. And I was like, I want to go see if I can visit her, in my dream. And I found myself standing in a room, and I had never been to where she was, my uncle's house, with her, watching her. And basically she had like a red towel laying on the bed. She was dressed a particular way. And there was white linens everywhere. And so I actually called her and said to her, hey, I'm fooling around with this thing, and here's what I saw. And she goes, Jade, oh my gosh, like, yeah, this is the room. Back then we didn't have, she couldn't like do a video and be like, oh, see and show me, because we didn't have cell phones back then and all that kind of stuff. But she said, yes, they have these towels, not quite red, but pink and white linens. And so vague type of stuff. So I don't know, was that real? Was that not real? But that gives you an idea of, kind of what I was dabbling in. And then when I went to Bastille and I saw lots of people doing certain things like this that I just thought were outlandish and weird and felt like they were just making stuff up. Mm-hmm. I quickly got very turned off
Yeah.
by that and essentially abandoned it
Yeah.
completely.
Did you ever at any point feel skeptical about the things that you had experienced and said, oh, I was probably making those things up as well?
100%. And as I learned more about science and medicine and studying, neuroscience and the way the brain works and child development, I started to just go, oh, all of this was just my brain developing. Those people that I would see when I was young, those were just my brain playing tricks on me. And they always happened to be, looking back, I'd be like, oh, that little girl I used to see was very much like my cousin Amber, right? And I just started to see that and think that all this was not real and was just me making meaning out of things and playing around in a dream state. And so, and by the way, just so we're clear, I still, look at that partially that way, although I've become less skeptic with some of the work that I do now in changing brainwave states and psychedelic work and some of the stuff I do now, and mainly not my own experience, but hearing and seeing patients of mine, clients of mine have experiences, watching them go through these experiences in retreats, seeing some pretty amazing healing things happen. And I think I've been kind of the last couple years, which is what you're saying, where I think the last couple years, it wasn't me going, oh, all that stuff I was dealing with was real for me. It's actually seeing, okay, I am actually seeing people have legit transformative experiences and healing and doing things and talking about things that make sense to me before and are causing profound changes in them now. And I think that is the main thing that has kind of moved me in this direction. But I'm also an evidence-based person. And so I'll be honest with you, I still think we humans are meaning-making machines. And I'm not sure what to make of this. So I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Totally. Well, I think that's why I decided to start this show in the first place, is because, I'm still learning. I'm still developing my belief system. I'm still a student. And I think that people who are in my position and even in your position, people who are still seeking that truth, if that's what you want to call it, and we're still somewhere in the middle. Right. And so I'd love to hear from you, right? Because we talked about your upbringing. We've talked about, the science background and then feeling really turned off by the things that you were being surrounded by. And, that was back in the 90s for you, but I still even feel some of that today with the way that spirituality is being commercialized and, just everything that's all over social media. So I 100% feel that part. And at the same time, I feel that there's truth and I'm constantly seeking that. And so, like I said, when I met you in 2018, you were completely out of it, but you had some experiences, that were a little bit undeniable. And so I'd love for you, and this is before you came back online with all of this stuff. So I'd love for you to just think back to that time, in your 20s when maybe you were moving out of that belief into that skepticism. And what is maybe the most surprising thing that happened to you that, maybe you can't quite explain or rationalize away?
Yeah, well, I have a story that, and basically this is one of the ones that's kind of documented in my family. And so I'll share it with you. And it's completely changed the way I see the world. And it does go down, I think, as the thing, even though it happened, early in medical school by the time I had started to abandon this. But it does go down in history as the thing that I think is the thing that makes me believe something else. And certainly I've studied ever since this event, which I'm going to tell you about, but ever since this event, and it has guided my study. And this event happened probably in early 2000. I was asleep in Seattle, Washington. My sister lived in New York City at the time. And I was asleep, and my grandmother, who had passed, and not someone that I was, I had a fine relationship with my grandmother, but I wasn't particularly close to her, came to me in my dream. And I'll never forget this. I felt a hand on my back. I knew it was my grandmother. And in my dream, I turned over to speak with her. And you know how these dreams can be weird. So I didn't see her face or anything. I just remember turning over and talking and having a conversation. I know we had a very long conversation and a very strange conversation, but I only remember two things from that conversation. One of the things that she said is, Jade, your sister is pregnant. By the way, my sister and her had a very close relationship. Your sister is pregnant. It's a boy. And then we had a bunch of other stuff that we talked about. And then I remember this phrase. She said, I want you to remember to stay out of the civil war in the family. Civil war. I remember that because I was like, what do you mean civil war in the family? Now, as it so happens, that morning, my sister happened to call me. Now, keep in mind, everyone, this is 2000. I didn't have a cell phone then. I think they existed, but I didn't have one. She called me on a landline. It's like 9 o'clock her time. I'm getting up for medical school. It's like 6 o'clock my time. I forget why we were speaking, but I had just woken up. And then she's calling me and I was like, so weird. I was just having a dream about you. You're pregnant. Well, actually, no, I said it like this because I'm the jokester in the family. I said, Jody, what's going on? Good morning. I said, how come you didn't tell me you're pregnant? And, I'm kind of the jokester or whatever. And she's like, shut the hell up, Jade. I am not pregnant. She had just started dating. They were like basically, I don't know, maybe a year into their relationship, her now husband, Ellie. And she goes, besides, I'm on the pill and I have no plans of getting pregnant. So I was like, well, I had this dream. You're definitely pregnant. Good luck with that. Right. And she didn't even ask me about the dream because I forget there was something else we were talking about. And she's just like, whatever, you're a clown, goodbye. And we hang up. And of course, I didn't think anything of that, except 2 weeks later, she calls me and she goes, Jade, I am pregnant. Tell me what this dream, like what happened. And of course, at that point, I'm like, what? And I'm spinning back in my head. What was this dream? And those were the only two things I remembered after that. So Jody ended up having a boy. His name is Soul Jade, named after me. Ellie, her fiance then, now her husband, heard that conversation between me and Jody. So they named their child after me. Now I ask you as someone who's an evidence-based person, I can't explain that. I don't know how that happened. And just as an addendum to this, about 10 years later, there was a fallout between my family where the family, I have 4 siblings, one of 4, and the family split, right, between Jody and Ellie and my older brother. There was this schism that happened. And I knew immediately when it happened because there was this event that happened that went down that we all witnesses. And I knew this is what the Civil War means. And that lasted for about 4 or 5 years. And I remained neutral. And I'm so glad that I did. Now, how do we explain stuff like that? I don't know. So that's one of these things where I go, that just doesn't make any sense. And it's something that I can corroborate because of the way the sequence of events went with somebody else, a shared reality, not something that I'm like, this happened to me and I can't explain that.
And, to add to your story a little bit, because I know it well, I know you and your family well. One of the things that I believe your grandmother said was that, it's a boy and he's going to be important or something to that extent, right?
Yes. And I oftentimes leave that part out for Soul's sake.
Yeah.
Because he has done already as a young, 20-year-old, he's done incredible things that, I think, but I feel like it's just a lot of pressure. And to me, I'm like, he already is incredible no matter what he does. Like he already is important.
We can shout out Soul. Was he valedictorian? He's a scholarship winner. He's young, working in venture capital, closing deals. Like it's pretty amazing. And he's just an incredible, mature human ever since I first knew him as a teenager.
Yeah, by all measures, Soul was 40 when he was born. He's done extraordinary things that none of us have done, of course, on a cultural level, but he's just grounded and beautiful and just wholly present in so many ways. And so, yeah, he's turned into an extraordinary human for our family, of course. And I think, anyone who's lucky enough to know Soul gets to experience that.
Yeah, totally. So let's fast forward a couple of years, 2018 era. You're like, I don't do that woo-woo stuff. Actually, that was, I would say my kind of spiritual journey and awakening started, I want to say maybe 2017. So I was like pretty new on the journey. And my introduction to a lot of this stuff was through coaches and mentors and things that I was reading and following. And I think subconsciously I had a lot more awareness about where I was going to go and the language I was using and things like that, like versus what I was consciously aware of at the time. And, you were a big catalyst in my life in so many different ways of my own journey, my own healing. So if we look at beyond 2018, I think really where you fit in for me in terms of introducing me to things and people that really accelerated my journey like nothing else had. That was like 2021. What was happening for you in those years that ultimately led you to this whole new place you found yourself in?
Well, it's like what I discovered in hindsight is I've been steeped in this throughout. I really have, so I was just stubbornly resisting it. And I'll tell you all why too. And I don't know if, I think you kind of know, but I don't know if I said this in this way to you. To me, it's kind of like this. I still see this field as, gosh, and I don't want to be harsh, but kind of bullshit. And I don't mean that like the people are bullshit, right? I just think that what happens is that there's a lot of bullshit that can happen, a lot of nonsense that can come up. And I think it contaminates this world to some degree. And I don't mean that it's coming from a place where people are intentionally trying to deceive. I think it's about clean filters. So like, for example, before we even met, when I moved to LA in 2014 actually, and then permanently in 2016. And I went on a mission. So this tells you I was steeped in this in my scientific brain. I looked for a psychic. I hired 8 psychics. Not to prove them wrong, but trying to prove to myself that there's something to this. And what I found with all of them is that they're just very good at reading people. And if I talked a lot, they had interesting things to say and could tap into stuff. But if I said virtually nothing, they couldn't, make any heads or tails or anything like that. And so for me, I just started to see that a lot of people are trying to make meaning, and a lot of people will identify themselves as spiritual in whatever ways. And we all know how this works in religion, right? Someone can be religious in a way, but not at all embody the practices of that religion or the key tenets of that religion. It's more an identity anchor to be better than. Mm-hmm. And I saw this same thing happening in spirituality, which kind of turned me off. And then I also saw that many of these people were no better than chance, like the rabbit's foot and astrology and all this stuff. I just didn't see as making much sense. And I'm an evidence-based guy. So I'm like, is it getting you results in your life? And the final thing I'll say is many of these people seemed pretty unhinged. Unhinged is probably the wrong word, but pretty messy in their lives. Mm-hmm. So part of me was just like when you meet a religious person who's, a hypocrite, you meet these spiritually inclined people and you just go, if you're so spiritual and you get it, and it's sort of namaste all day kind of thing, and then you're messing, you're being mean and critical and whatever. I just got a very bad taste in my mouth in this whole domain. And I'll say one more thing about that. And then, because I think you asked what happened. I think what happened is I started to see that as I became more mature and aligned, that my signal to, let's call it source, began to really create powerful results in my life. And what I mean by that is that when I started really looking around and getting clear on my authenticity and my alignment, it seemed that I was getting downloads, mainly in the creative sense. I would be in the shower and get this complete creative download for a program. And I would be out walking and be like, oh my God, where did that come from? Yeah. And I started to see very clearly that, and of course, it took some maturity and some, removing my ego, because I started to see this stuff I don't think is coming from you, Jade. Like this is not your brilliance. Like there's something coming through you, but it's not, it's like you got this piece and that piece and that piece and this piece, and then all of a sudden you put it all together and this magic thing pops out, and it helps you and it helps others. And that started happening enough to me that I was like, you know what? I don't think I can deny this anymore. And I want more out of my life, and I want to help more people in this way. And I think that's when the shift started happening for me. And I still don't know, by the way, if this is just me making stuff up and meaning making, or if there's really something here. But I have basically the last decade studied. So I have what I think is happening. but I still don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the truth is, no one can actually prove anything of it, right? And again, that's why this entire show exists. And whether it's provable, right, or not, I don't think it necessarily matters. I think it's about finding a place in your belief system that feels true and aligned for you. And I think that's why having people like you share their stories is so powerful for people. And, I love that we're having this very real conversation because I still consider myself a skeptic. You clearly do as well. And it just gives people permission to not be one or the other, right? Believer or non-believer, but it allows people to be open and curious and to learn from other people's stories and experiences. And I will say, that has been one of the most powerful components for me in terms of my own growth and my openness to all of these things. And what's really funny is, this story about hiring psychics and intuitives and things like that. I remember I was in Switzerland in 2021 and you and I were talking and you were like, I just had a call with this intuitive and you have to meet her. And so I did. And her name's Romy and she's actually going to be on this show as well. And she's been my closest confidant, spiritual guide and mentor pretty much ever since. So it's just so kind of funny and ironic to me that, we meet and you're like, I don't do any of that woo stuff. And then ultimately you end up introducing me to her, who was one of the most powerful influencers of my entire life. And you introduced me to other, again, people, to psychedelic work that opened me in a way that I would have never opened before. So really all of that is to your credit. And I'm so thankful for that. But I just think it's really funny given your heavily skeptical background still to this day.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And actually, that was an interesting, there's only two people, I've always been seeking these people. There's only two people I can think of that when I first had a conversation with Romy, I was like, there is no doubt she is picking up on something very powerful that I know nothing about. And I have now had some of those experiences, and she was one of them. And so, yeah, when they happen, it makes you go, there is, I think, some magic in the world, and there are some people tapped into things that you can't explain. And I do think she is one of them. And I also think, speaking of the psychedelic work, I think that is one of the things, too, that I was terrified of all of that work, because coming up, I thought it was drugs and, my mom coming from the hippie space, like I've got uncles that, remember, I've got one uncle in particular that my mom says, we remember the day he left the house, one human, and the day he came back, another human. That whole idea of frying your brain on a LSD trip or whatever these stories we heard. My mom actually has that story, and my uncle actually has that story. But once I started delving in that arena, it also started to further my understanding of what I believe, what I might call the source field is. Some people might call it God, physicists call it the 0 point field, woo-woo types call it the universe. I've come to just calling it source and the source field. And to me, it's this sort of area of, consciousness, broader consciousness, let's call it consciousness at large, or, the information field where all possibility and potential exists. And this is something I think people like Romy can tap into. And I think if we start to understand, and this is the science person in me who's been kicking and screaming, science is what is pulling me into this place, that this idea of the brain as receiver of consciousness versus the brain as producer of consciousness really is where I started to go, okay, now that I'm understanding this new scientific paradigm, this explains some of my spiritual experiences, predicting soul's birth and things like that. And I want to go further with that, which then brought me into the world of psychedelics, which then brought me into a whole other level of skepticism, because that world also is just filled with nonsense and people who do this stuff again and again and again and again, who have no different changes, who seem to go off on wild tangents on things. And so it's super messy, but there is something there. And that also has informed a little bit, because I feel like now I have a direct experience, reproducible, to access this greater field of consciousness. And now I've, of course, moved on to doing this without psychedelics at all, and doing it simply through breath, intention, meditation, and visualization, all the way back to what I was doing with lucid dreaming. So this is really weird thing. And now I spend my time teaching people how to reproduce the lucid dreaming state to get access to this, whatever we want to call it.
Totally. Yeah. And I completely agree with you. It's certainly one of, even when I was thinking about starting this show, because have such an aversion to the commercialization of spirituality, to psychedelics, and, just the messiness, as you said, of it all, the noise of it all, there was some hesitation for me for sure, because I'm like, I don't want to be part of that. And I also don't want to claim to be an expert of any kind. I'm still a student in all of this. But I think that, through all of the experiences that I've had, and probably through the experiences of others as well, I think as long as the intention is right and good and truth seeking, I do think that, through any experience, you find those kind of, yes, there's like all of the noise, but there are those slivers of truth and ancient wisdom that we can all tap into, whether you're doing it through breath work and meditation, or whether you're on a psychedelic journey and things like that. I think we just have to be careful with, again, our intentions, with who we surround ourselves with in any of those experiences, who we listen to, and really just find, again, and this has been something I've said a few times while we've been talking, is just like finding that piece of truth that is true for you and what feels genuine and real and authentic for you.
Yeah. I see it. I mean, I see it kind of like this. I feel like when we are dabbling in this space, it's really about being a pure filter, and it's about choosing tools. So for example, we have, as humans, we have fear-based instinct, and we have heart-based, sort of love-based intuition. And if we move into these tools to try to tap into some of this spirituality, and we're coming from instinct, which feels exactly like intuition if you're not well trained, versus our intuition or higher insight, then we can get confused a little bit in how we translate this kind of stuff. So I do think that's why the internal work of getting clear on what is instinct and fear-based, what is love and intuition based, and what is higher insight based. And you can begin to discern a little bit. And then I feel like when I see that, I feel like the tool doesn't matter. At that point, if you're square there, you might be someone who's into human design, and that tool helps you pull down some of these downloads. Or you might be into tarot, and that tool helps you pull down some of these downloads. Or you might be into a religion, and it helps you pull down some of these downloads. So now I have become agnostic in the tool and agnostic in the direction. And I'm super interested now in not being like, that's ridiculous, or I'm just like, what is this person a clear filter and channel? And then I'm interested in what tool are they using to do that? And I think there are many, many different ways. And so that's how I've kind of made sense of this mess. We're all human. There's no such thing as a guru. I think if you are a guru, you don't need human school. That's for sure. You wouldn't be here, so I don't think there's any gurus. And I think the instinct, intuition, insight-based clarity is what we need to work on within ourselves. And then I think there's a number of different tools: human design, astrology, tarot. Like, there's a ton of different tools that people can use in their channeling or their ability to tap into whatever this thing is. And whether it's real or not, I'm interested in that, because I have found wisdom. I have found very wise people with very useful information for me in multiple places using multiple tools.
Totally. Well, this is a good kind of segue into where you are now. You started to kind of talk about some of these things earlier in terms of what you're seeing with your work. The work that you do has very practical, tangible components to it, but in the work you've also seen unexplainable things happen. So as we're here to learn and work through our belief systems through storytelling, I'd love for you to share a story or two that may seem unexplainable by what we consider to be normal, or how things tend to operate just based on the work that you've done with people, and maybe a little bit of context for how you actually perform that work.
Yeah. And I'll give you, just because I'm an evidence-based guy as well, I'll give you one that has been documented.
Yes.
And I've done a podcast on it, and it's documented through research, because this particular person was in a research study. And so my work, just briefly, consists of altering brainwave states into theta and alpha brainwave states, subconscious states, to access the subconscious and perhaps consciousness at large, if that's what we're doing. And I say, if that's what we're doing, because I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know completely, despite the fact that I sit and read research all day. I don't know exactly how this is working. But what I do is drop people into different subconscious states. And what I have learned in my work, which is narrative psychology, transpersonal psychology, identity psychology, is that our identities are made up of stories. And these stories are what inform how the world shows up to us and who it is that we think we are. And these stories are held in our subconscious and they create our identity. So my work essentially goes, we're going to go into the subconscious. We're going to go into areas of your life that may have been difficult, that wrote difficult stories. Now, I call this MUD, misguided, unconscious decisions. They're misguided because you make these decisions at times when you don't have the knowledge, the experience, the know-how, the wisdom, the maturity, when we're teenagers, when we're in our 20s, when we're kids. They're unconscious because we don't realize these patterns follow us around, and they're decisions because whether you remember it or not, you did make a choice. So this mud gets stuck on us. So this particular person who certified with me in my certifications and came to one of my very first retreats where we work on mud, and we put you into altered states of consciousness, primarily through breath and intention. Best way to describe it, it's not breath work. It's basically a controlled form of lucid dreaming. And in this experience, she came face to face with her mud. She has told this story. It's on my podcast. Her name is Naomi Han. Anyone can go and look this up and she'll share it with you. She came face to face with some of her demons, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, not being able to have feeling safe in her environment where she grew up. She had never told her husband about this. She had essentially carried this her whole life into her 40s. Now, she had also had a history of 18 years of hepatitis B. For those of you who do not know, hepatitis B is an incurable virus that affects the liver, and it is a chronic viral infection. It causes liver inflammation, and you can measure the viral titers or number of viruses. So she has this breakthrough. She starts talking about this experience she had. She starts crying for the first time in her life. She was just a very stoic person, and she starts to release all this energy. And let's be honest, was not comfortable for her. So there was this release happening, this energetic shedding. And within 6 months, because she would be getting these things basically measured every 6 months, her viral titers essentially disappeared and her inflammation markers essentially disappeared after 18 years study of this being exactly the same. And she came to me and said, Jade, this work, that clearing, that thing that happened to me, it healed my hepatitis B. It cleared this virus. And of course, I'm like, Naomi, we can't say that. No, it did not. You cannot say that, let's wait another 6 months. And what else were you doing? What supplements were you taking? What drugs were you taking? She waits another 6 months, still gone. Let's wait another 6 months, still gone. 4 successive now measures inside this study, still gone. So you make your own choice about this. But to me, I go, there is something really powerful here that we don't understand that is happening with our connection to our subconscious stories that we hold and some other healing potential in the body. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but I will give you a hint. If you really start looking at this research, there is this idea that the greater consciousness coalesces down into our biofield. Our biofield is then translated into biochemistry via biological water. If for anyone who's like, I want to chase this down, this is what I think might be happening. But the truth is we're clueless about how this is really working. Now, I have seen this happen with my own mother now. I have seen this happen with back pain, kidney cancer. Joe Dispenza, for those of you who know this work, has also been reporting these kinds of things. We are on the frontier of something really remarkable. Now, does this mean there's something else? I don't know. It could just mean a different way of interacting with the body and the mind-body connection. But when you put all this together, my experiences that I've had watching this stuff happen to people, understanding the science and how all this is converging, for me, I am still a skeptic, but I am much less so than I've ever been.
Yeah, it's so amazing, that work that you've done and the way that people receive it. And you really are just such a well-researched expert in this field. And I do just really find it helpful to know that there is that layer of skepticism that you are working through, even when you're presented with these stories. But it kind of feels like you're, teetering into that place of stronger belief than skepticism or denial, I would say, just knowing you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's that whole phrase, being dragged, kicking and screaming. And, I guess someone could make the argument, Jade, you've always been geared in this direction. But yeah, it's been a wild ride, and I am more open to the possibilities than I have ever been.
Yeah, I love it. And so, if people are interested in getting to know this work, maybe it would be helpful for them to know, like, what are you currently reading, researching, studying that is the most interesting to you right now?
Yeah. I am just so into the idea of what I just told you, what that I might call quantum metabolism, just how we are now understanding how the physiology is quantum. Photosynthesis is using quantum physics to do its work. We used to think in biology, when I came up in biology and biochemistry, these two worlds were completely separate. Quantum physics could not happen in the wet, wild world of macro biology. Now we're showing that it is. We're showing that water inside our fascia is creating coherence domains that are allowing photons in our body to travel around at the speed of light, far faster than nerve conduction. This is the stuff that I'm absolutely fascinated by, because if this is true, and it is controversial, of course, as all new science is, but if this is true, what it means, it doesn't mean that the current chemistry and biochemistry that we all learn in school is false. But what it means is there's a separate, perhaps faster, energetic scaffolding that our biochemistry sits on top of. And just to give you an example for those who understand, you remember in your chemistry class, right? You would have one molecule like this and another molecule shaped like this, and they're supposed to fit together and bind and create a chemical reaction. Well, the interesting thing is these things have to float around, and by biology, that first they have to find each other, right? Which isn't easy. And then they have to create this energetic reaction. Now, everything that happens in our biology and biochemistry is surrounded by water. What we're now understanding is that water is what is creating the connection, bringing them perhaps together and creating the coherence in our body. And you don't have to, be a scientist to understand water and its relationship to electricity and its ability to conduct. And we are seeing phenomenal things happen as we're understanding that there's not ice, vapor, and liquid. There's a fourth phase of water that creates more hexagonal lattice type structures inside of our body, more viscous in nature, more aligned, that can increase communication in the body. And so now we are opening up a whole new sphere that might explain how our biochemistry can be influenced by greater consciousness, if that's what's going on. But that is what fascinates me and where I spend all my time. And if you're interested in this stuff, you can follow me on my Substack. It's Dr. Jade Teta and the Next Level Human Substack, where I talk about a lot of this stuff. But again, just so we're all clear, I don't know, but this is the area that fascinates me because it's the only area that can make sense of some of this craziness that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I know you kind of live on that convergence of science and spirituality. And so it's not surprising that that work is interesting to you as it's interesting to me. And yeah, I can't wait to see, learn through you for all the work that you do. And based on the work that you're doing, and of course, all of your life experience, what's the one thing that you would want people to know?
Oh, well, I guess the one thing that I'd want you to know is the one thing that I wish I could know, right? Belief and knowing are two different things, right? You can believe something, but when you really know something, I would want us to know that we can heal, that, I've seen it in other people. I'm going through my own health stuff now, and I'm wanting to believe it for myself or know it in myself. But I would want to know that, and really truly know like to stop being a skeptic would be nice, right? Like to just like have certainty would be a little bit nice. I wish that I could help you all understand that there is some magic going on. I can tell you that. I don't know exactly what it is, but I do want you all to know that. And I wish that I could know for certain. I just don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that summarizes exactly how I feel. And again, why I decided to create this show. And I think, hearing your personal stories in your life and your experiences working with clients. And obviously, I've heard even more than what you've been able to share in a short time here. It's pretty extraordinary. And I think, leaves us both in the conclusion that there is magic and that there are things that are undeniable and that perhaps as humans we can't understand or can't at least make sense of yet. And I just appreciate you sharing yourself in this way that, you haven't quite as much. And I should have started with this, but I also want to recognize you as, a best-selling author. You've written what, like 10 books at this point?
Yeah, I've written a bunch.
Yeah. So
I've written a bunch.
So look Jade up. You mentioned your Substack. You're also on Instagram, Jade Teta, right? At Jade Teta.
Yeah.
And, I don't just say this because of the closeness between us, but you are truly a genius and one of the people who has, positive influence over many people, that probably the most powerful that I know. And I'm just so grateful for the way that you've impacted my life personally. And I love witnessing the work that you do in the world, the way that people respond to you, how transformational it is. And one thing I would want people to know about you is that you have modeled and taught me things like kindness, generosity, honesty, in ways that I would have, maybe never, like at levels I would have maybe never reached myself, because you've modeled all of those things. So, your brand is called Next Level Human, and you exemplify that more than anyone else I've ever known. And I'm just super grateful for you today and always.
Thank you so much. Thank you for loving me the way you do. And honestly, thank you for this. Like, I think it's incredibly, you and I have talked about this, but I just want to say it here. It's incredibly brave to do this. And yeah, I adore you. Thank you.
You, Jade. Thanks.